A simple question from an 8-year-old girl brought a crowded town hall to a standstill, leading Donald Trump to share a deeply personal story of faith, loss, and redemption. What followed touched every heart in the room. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Your support will help fund my dad's cancer operation. Thank you. The Church Fellowship Hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, hummed softly with the sounds of folding chairs scraping against polished floors and quiet conversations. Normally used for Sunday potlucks and Bible study, the space had a different energy that evening. Standing at the front was Donald Trump, his commanding presence filling the modest hall. His orange-hued complexion and signature hand gestures were familiar sights, yet tonight he appeared unusually subdued, as if attuned to the significance of the moment. The audience comprised families, retirees, and local residents, drawn by curiosity about what he had to say. Amidst the crowd, one figure stood out, not due to her size, but because of her focused intensity. 8-year-old Lily, dressed in her finest Sunday dress, clutched an old leather-bound Bible against her chest. The cherished heirloom, passed down from her late grandmother, showed its age in its worn pages and faded gold lettering. Her mother, seated beside her, leaned close before they entered and whispered, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough and truly mean it." Lily nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. For weeks, she had rehearsed her question, scribbling it in her notebook during recess and whispering it to herself before falling asleep at night. This wasn't a question driven by childish curiosity. It weighed heavily on her young heart. As the evening unfolded, Trump addressed his usual topics, policies, accomplishments, and his vision for America's future. The audience responded with occasional claps and nods of agreement, though the atmosphere lacked the fervor of his typical rallies. Meanwhile, Lily waited patiently, her small hands tightening their grip on the edges of her Bible with every passing moment. When the floor finally opened for questions, a line formed quickly. Adults stepped up eagerly to discuss local concerns, national policies, and even offer compliments on Trump's signature red tie. Lily hesitated, shrinking slightly into her seat. But her mother's gentle nudge reminded her it was her chance, her moment. Her legs felt unsteady as she rose, her heart pounding so loudly she was convinced the entire room could hear it. The line ahead of her seemed to stretch endlessly. But as she inched forward, the chatter in the hall began to quiet. People turned their attention to her, a small girl clutching an oversized Bible tightly against her chest. Whispers rippled softly through the crowd. When her turn arrived, Trump looked down at her, his demeanor briefly softening. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his tone unexpectedly gentle. Lily swallowed hard, her grip on the Bible so firm her knuckles turned pale. With a trembling voice that refused to falter, she spoke the question that had been living in her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room immediately fell into a profound silence. All eyes shifted between the girl and Trump, the weight of her question hanging heavily in the air, almost palpable. For a man celebrated for his rapid-fire responses, Trump didn't reply immediately. His gaze moved from her face to the Bible she held tightly, and a subtle change came over him. Before he could say a word, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, the anticipation pulling everyone to the edges of their seats. The silence from Trump was striking. A man who had built a career on quick retorts and steadfast confidence now seemed momentarily unsure. He stared at Lily, his usual boldness giving way to a softness, an almost vulnerable demeanor. His attention lingered on the worn Bible in her hands. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Lily shifted, her small frame appearing even more delicate under the room's focused gaze. Her question hadn't been posed to challenge or provoke. It was a sincere inquiry, stemming from a deep longing to grasp something greater than herself. That honesty reverberated through the room louder than any heated political exchange or enthusiastic chant ever could. The crowd remained utterly still. Even the faint sounds of shifting chairs or muffled coughs seemed to disappear, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Trump finally lifted his hand slightly, as if steadying himself, and leaned against the podium. "That's a big question," he began, his voice quieter and more composed than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." The crowd was taken aback. Trump, a figure synonymous with unwavering self-assurance, was openly admitting uncertainty. His gaze returned to Lily, and his expression softened further, revealing something almost fatherly. "When I was about your age," he said, "I had plenty of questions about God, too. My parents would take me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, staring at the stained glass windows, and wondering if God was even listening to me." He paused, glancing across the audience as though measuring their response. His hand rested on the podium's edge, his fingers tapping softly against the wood grain. My father used to tell me, he continued, that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and even when you're afraid of falling, you keep going because there's something up there worth reaching for. Back then, I didn't really get what he meant. I just thought it was his way of keeping me quiet. A soft chuckle rippled through the room, easing the tension slightly. Lily, however, didn't laugh. Her wide eyes stayed locked on him, waiting for the deeper answer she had come to hear. Trump leaned in slightly, his voice becoming even softer. But as I grew older, life threw challenges my way, losses, failures, and moments when I wasn't sure I could keep moving forward. During those times, I didn't always feel God's presence. Sometimes I was angry at him. Other times I thought maybe he'd abandoned me altogether. The audience remained riveted. This wasn't the polished, rehearsed rhetoric they had come to expect. This was raw, this was real. But let me tell you this, Trump continued, his voice gaining a touch of strength. Even in my darkest moments when I felt utterly alone, I came to realize something. Faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about trusting that, even when you can't see the full picture, there's a purpose, something bigger than yourself at work. His eyes returned to Lily, whose hands had relaxed their tight grip on the Bible. The light above reflected in her wide, glistening eyes. And God to me, he said with deliberate care, is that purpose. He's the reason that, even when we fall and even when we fail, we're never truly finished. He's the voice urging us to keep climbing, even when the ladder feels like it might break. Before the weight of his words could fully settle, Lily's eyes began to fill with tears, and a soft murmur rippled through the crowd, who sensed that something extraordinary was taking place. At first, her tears came gently, a single drop sliding down her cheek as she clutched her grandmother's Bible even tighter against her chest. But as Trump's words lingered in the stillness, her small shoulders began to quiver. The crowd noticed the shift, their quiet whispers growing louder, yet no one dared break the moment. Lily's mother leaned closer, placing a soothing hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured tenderly. But Lily shook her head. These weren't tears of sadness. They came from somewhere far deeper. Trump's words had reached a part of her heart she hadn't realized needed healing, unlocking emotions she had long kept tucked away. Trump appeared to notice her reaction, stepping back from the podium. His face, usually so assured, softened with quiet understanding. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Lily," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "That's a beautiful name," he said with a faint, warm smile. "You know, Lily," he continued, his voice carrying a thoughtful tone, "sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer, and sometimes those very questions remind us of what truly matters." Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never straying from his. "My grandma used to say that too," she whispered softly. "She always said God is always listening, even when you can't hear him." Trump's expression shifted briefly, a silent mix of admiration and deep understanding crossing his face. He took a steadying breath, then turned his attention back to the crowd. "You know, this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask," he said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "What does God mean to us?" It's not an easy question, because it forces us to look inward, to confront our fears, our doubts, and our flaws. The room fell into an intense silence, the weight of his words settling over everyone. For a moment, it felt as though Lily wasn't merely a young girl holding a Bible, but a living symbol of something much greater. Her courage had completely shifted the mood of the evening, transforming it from a standard town hall into a profound, personal reflection on faith and the essence of humanity. Trump continued, his voice steady but noticeably softer than before. "We live in a world where we're constantly searching for answers outside of ourselves. We think that power, success, or money will fill the void. But they don't. The real answers, the ones that truly matter, are often the ones that make us uncomfortable. The ones that make us ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is looking?" He paused, his gaze returning to Lily, softening with gratitude. "Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily. You're wiser than most adults I know." The crowd erupted into soft applause, but Lily seemed completely unaware of the attention. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a quiet pride that filled her young face. She gently wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress, her eyes meeting her mother's, who returned the gaze with glistening eyes of her own. As the applause began to subside, Trump's tone shifted once again, hinting that the conversation was far from over. It felt as though the room was about to be drawn even deeper into his story. The room grew quieter still, the air thick with anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath for what would come next. Trump shifted slightly at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling back on Lily. His expression had changed, a heaviness settling in that seemed to come from a place far deeper than politics or public life. When I was a young man, Trump began, his voice softening, out. I had ambition, plans, and the drive to succeed. But there was one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I actually had. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The crowd leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. Trump rarely opened up about his personal life, and it seemed that, for once, he was about to share something deeply personal. My brother Fred, Trump continued, he was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had a light about him, a goodness that I couldn't fully grasp at the time. But Fred struggled. He had his demons. And despite all the love and support my family and I gave him, it wasn't enough. Trump's voice faltered for a brief moment before he cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. When he passed away, he continued, I was angry. Angry at him, angry at myself, and angry at God. He took a slow breath, his expression growing heavy. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to leave this world so soon. Lily's gaze never left him, her face showing an expression far too wise for her years. Around the room, others shared similar expressions, a mixture of empathy, understanding, and a profound connection to his words. For a long time after that, Trump went on, I turned away from God. I thought to myself, if he was real, why would he let something like that happen? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind? Trump exhaled deeply, his hand gripping the edge of the podium as though holding on to something much deeper. But then something changed. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred's face in my mind. He was smiling, this big, goofy smile he always had, and I heard him say, Don, don't be angry, you've got work to do. The room fell into complete silence, the weight of his words pressing on everyone like a heavy, tangible force. Even the faint sounds of cars passing outside seemed to fade into nothingness, as though the world had momentarily stopped to absorb the gravity of what he had just shared. It felt as if the very air in the room was thick with emotion, holding every heart captive in that moment. I realized then, Trump said, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper, that faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a reason, even when you can't see it, and maybe, just maybe, Fred's purpose was to teach me that. He turned his gaze back to Lily, his expression softening, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. So, when you ask me what God means to me, Trump continued, I'll say this. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves. And he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times. Lily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears once again, but this time, they didn't fall. Instead, she stood just a little taller, her small hands clutching her grandmother's Bible, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The room seemed to settle into the weight of his story, but just as it did, someone in the back of the audience raised their hand. The quiet was broken, pulling everyone's attention in a new direction, the tension shifting from reflection to the anticipation of what would come next. At the back of the room, a man stood up slowly, his hand raised, waiting to speak. His face was weathered by years of hard work, his expression serious, the kind of person you'd pass by on the street without a second thought. Perhaps a mechanic, a father, someone who attended church when life allowed. But when he spoke, his voice shattered the stillness, cutting through the quiet like a bell. Mr. Trump, he began, his words deliberate, carefully measured, I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, makes me wonder if we've all been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? His question caught Trump off guard, but he quickly regained his composure, leaning in slightly on the podium, his gaze locking with the man's. You know, Trump began, his voice softer now, I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes it feels like we're shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying, even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening as he sank back into his seat. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but before the room could settle again, Lily's voice broke through. My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds, she said, her words steady and clear despite her small frame. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. Trump's expression softened into a genuine, almost tender smile, a rare change from his usual guarded demeanor. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, he said warmly. And she's right. Faith is like a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see. The conversation filled the room with renewed energy. People began to nod, exchange knowing glances, and even quietly whisper to one another. What began as a formal town hall gradually transformed into something much more intimate, a collective reflection on life's struggles, uncertainties, and moments of grace. An elderly woman, her silver hair neatly pulled back into a bun, raised her hand, her presence calm yet filled with emotion. I lost my husband last year, she began, her voice quivering with vulnerability. Since then, I've been angry at God. It feels like I've completely lost my faith. Do you think it's too late for me to find it again? Trump, sensing the depth of her words, moved closer to the front of the stage. His voice softened, taking on a reassuring tone as he spoke. It's never too late, he answered. Faith isn't something you lose for good. It's always waiting for you, even when it feels out of reach. Sometimes it's in the quietest of moments, when you least expect it, that faith quietly returns to you. The woman nodded, tears welling up in her eyes as his words seemed to offer comfort. Across the room, others were equally moved by the exchange. Some wiped their eyes with tissues, while others simply sat in quiet contemplation, each person deeply affected by the powerful connection unfolding before them. As Trump's words sank in, it became evident that the evening had shifted. This wasn't just about questions and answers, it was about connection. The room was charged with a palpable energy, not from noise, but from a shared sense of vulnerability. What began as a political event had transformed into something deeply personal. Lily's simple question had opened a door to a conversation no one had dared to enter before, and now, no one was willing to turn back. Trump stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the room. I've learned over the years that faith doesn't always come in grand moments. Sometimes it's in the small ones, the times when someone offers a hand, listens to your pain, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those are the moments that remind us of what really matters. The room fell silent, each person hanging on his words. Trump, usually known for his commanding presence, now spoke with a humility that resonated deeply. He motioned to Lily. This young girl reminded me that faith isn't just something we talk about, it's something we live, and when we do, it spreads. Lily smiled, her cheeks still rosy from earlier. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something that made her smile even brighter. Trump's tone became more resolute. We're in a time where it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, differences, opinions. But faith has the power to unite us. It's not about being the same. It's about realizing we're all climbing that same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths are. A wave of applause began, slow but building. People stood, clapping not just for Trump, but for the moment, for the courage Lily had shown in asking her question and the answers that followed. As the applause died down, Trump spoke one last time. Tonight, I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you, and don't fear the answer, no matter how uncertain. Faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing. He paused for a moment, then added, if something tonight moved you, hold on to it. Let it grow and share it with those who need it most. The applause returned, but this time it was mixed with hugs, handshakes, and even tears. Strangers who had walked in with only polite nods now stayed, exchanging smiles and stories. It felt as though a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet hope. Lily, standing with her mother, watched as Trump stepped away from the podium. He walked over, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. Thank you, Lily, he said, his voice soft but sincere. You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Never lose that. She nodded, extending her hand to shake his. Thank you, Mr. Trump, she said, her voice steady now. Trump gave her a faint smile, then turned to wave at the crowd as he exited. The room buzzed with conversation, everyone visibly changed by what had just happened. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but determined. Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she? Her mother smiled, tears filling her eyes. She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed. As the hall emptied, the message was clear. Sometimes the bravest questions lead to unexpected answers, and in those answers, we discover parts of ourselves we never knew were missing. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and unite us.